Hello, government students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 10, Section 3, Electing the President. So, when we talk about electing the president, there is a certain pathway that we need to kind of take a look at. First, our candidates have got to declare their candidacy. A lot of times in this day and age, that happens literally a year or more before there's actually a presidential election, or at least a general election. Part of that is so that they can build up the momentum to get political backers and to build up their candidacy. All right. Uh, each party will basically have primaries or caucuses in each state, and it's those events that's going to help assign delegates that are going to go to each political party's nominating convention. So the Republicans would have a convention, the Democrats have their own convention, and it's these primaries that kind of line this up, or the caucuses, depending on if you live in a state that has that. From there, the parties will hold their nominating conventions to select the presidential and vice presidential candidates for the general election. Truth is, in this day and age, a lot of times we know who's going to be the nominee before there's ever a convention. So, like in 2020, that's pretty much already been decided. And we haven't even had, for the most part, a primary in our state, but we kind of know who the major candidates are going to be. All right. Aside from that, there is going to be a general election. General elections are typically held in November, whereas a primary election, at least in the state of Nebraska, is usually held in the month of May. But it's that general election that's going to help assign the Electoral College electors. And it's really the Electoral College, for the most part, that really officially and directly votes for the president. Okay, the Electoral College will typically meet, usually it's about 3 weeks after the November election. And what they will determine is the winner of that election. And typically, to win the Electoral College, a candidate needs 270 votes. And if you get those votes, then you win. And thus, it can happen. There have been times when you have a candidate that has more popular votes, which, by the way, that's what happens in our general election, but yet still doesn't win the Electoral College. An example of that would be in the 2000 election, which was a pretty closely contended election. Al Gore had won the popular vote, but the Electoral College was won by George W. Bush. All right. If no candidate receives 270 electoral votes in the Electoral College, Congress will then vote to determine which candidate becomes president. That's happened when we talk about the election of 1870. I got to think, 1870. Basically, it's the election that ends the situation with the Reconstruction in the South. And certainly there were a lot of people that were really not necessarily happy with the results of that election, by all means. All right, we're going to talk about these guys: Rutherford Hayes, John Quincy Adams, Grover Cleveland, and George W. Bush. When we talk about the Electoral College, okay, each one of these guys has had their I guess you could say, their issues here. You could talk about the election of Hayes. When we talk about wrapping up the Reconstruction, John Quincy Adams, and some of the things that were happening as far as the decision of his presidency. But in 1789, when our founders had basically just kind of wrapped up the drafting of the Constitution, they decided the following. They thought that each state should choose their own electors equal to the number of senators and representatives, and that the Electoral College would vote for the president and the vice president in their own states. And then finally, candidates with the most votes would become president. Whoever is the second runner-up would be basically the vice president. And that sounds kind of interesting, but if you think about this last part, it's possible that you could have, in the day and age of political parties, you could have a president and a vice president be of differing political parties if we would go with that model. Okay, 1804, we had passed the 12th Amendment, and that basically required that electors cast their ballots separately for president and vice president, with the hopes that it would kind of clear up this mess with the political parties. No candidate received a majority vote, meaning the 270s votes that it was needed to win the Electoral College. Then the House of Representatives would choose the president from the top three candidates. Today, people, for the most part, really don't vote directly for the president and vice president, but for all their party's electors in that state. There are some states, like our state, like Nebraska, where we do not have what is called a winner take all, meaning that we can split up our electoral votes. So it's possible that based on the congressional district that you live in, if let's say the people of the second congressional district of Nebraska, which is like the Omaha metropolitan area, Douglas and Sarpy counties, the people there could maybe choose a Democratic candidate, whereas the rest of the state might have voted for a Republican candidate. And so maybe the Republican would get 4 electoral votes, and the one that comes out of that congressional district would go to the Democratic Party. We did that back in 2008 during the election of Barack Obama. Anyway, the number of votes in the Electoral College is equal to that of the state's representation in Congress. And then finally, currently at the moment, it takes basically 270 out of the 538 votes that are out there. That includes representation for the District of Columbia. That's where those extra 3 come from. Anyway, if a candidate basically gets 270 votes, they are your president. So that's the reason why a lot of times on election night, the commentators are always looking at, maybe what the numbers are. If you were going to look at electoral votes based on states, obviously there are certain states that candidates would really love to win. California happens to be one of those. If you take a look, they have 55 electoral votes. Texas, 38. New York and Florida both have 29 electoral votes. So certainly winning those big states would certainly make some candidates feel really good. But it is possible that a person could win the presidency without winning those big states. And that certainly happened for George W. Bush. He was able to garner up votes in what I would call the red belt, and basically go on to win the White House. So certainly we could split those votes, and that can make things a little bit more exciting by all means. When we look at our previous elections, one thing that we should remember is that sometimes these electoral votes will change whenever we take a census. The states of Missouri and Iowa, Illinois, all lost electoral votes in the last 10 years. States like Nevada and Texas, they gained votes. These things can fluctuate occasionally. And so we need to keep that in the back of our minds. Okay, and when you talk about political parties, certainly that is a factor. I mentioned before the red belt in this vicinity, but if you look at your coast, particularly the West Coast, they have a tendency to lean towards the Democratic Party a little bit, particularly Northeast. That's a region that seems to do that as well. So, according to the winner take all weakness, the Electoral College system is unfair to those who vote for a losing candidate, since the party whose candidate receives the popular vote in any state wins all the state's electoral votes. And there are some people that think that winner take all is not necessarily a great thing. That's one of the reasons why in Nebraska we've kind of dropped that idea and have adopted this idea that we assign these votes based on the congressional districts. Anyway, Electoral College, a third party could possibly win enough electoral votes to prevent either majority candidates from receiving the majority of votes. It could happen. We haven't really seen it in our recent years, but it certainly would bring a little more excitement to the whole election process if we had a third party candidate that could kind of divide the votes a little bit. And number 3, if the House votes for the president and some members of Congress favor a strong third party candidate, it might be hard for any candidate to win 26 votes that they need. Anyway, One proposed reform to the Electoral College is to choose electors by the congressional district. Nebraska is one of those states that does this. The other state is the state of Maine. Number 5, one of the problems with doing away with the Electoral College is that it would undermine this whole idea of federalism because states would lose their role in choosing a president. There are some people today that would love to see the Electoral College eliminated. Matter of fact, a lot of them are Democrats. I would be one to say that maybe our founding fathers knew something, and maybe this is something that we want to keep in place in a way to protect our states, particularly small states like Nebraska. Anyway, the new president, once we have had our November general election, if we get a brand new person coming into the White House, they are going to be known as president-elect until they are inaugurated as president at noon on January 20th. If you remember that 20th Amendment, it's the amendment that moved the inauguration date to January 20th. That's one way to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. All right. Thank you very much.